Good evening and welcome to everybody here at the EVM and the Institute for Human Sciences, and those people who are also watching or listening online. For those who don't know, particularly those from the outside, I'm Misha Glenny. I'm the rector of the IWM, and it is a peculiar pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Misha Scheppele. Do you know, I've looked at a few of her talks on YouTube, and everyone who introduces her says the same thing. They say she has so many achievements under her belt that we can't possibly list them here. So I'm not going to go, I'm going to go sort of in that direction, but I do want to mention a couple of things, because she is, of course, a professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton, and she was here in Vienna, or in Budapest. Was it Budapest or Vienna? It was Budapest.
6 months in Vienna, but 4 years in Budapest.
Right, 4 years in Budapest as the co-founder and director of the Gender Studies program at the Central European University, and the director of the program in Law and Public Affairs at Princeton as well. So she specializes, as most people know, in the sociology of law, and we're going to talk about this evening. I have to say, it's, for me, it's of personal interest, because about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I can't remember when, I made a podcast called The Rise of the Iron Men, and which deals with many of the subjects that you're going to address. But what I was particularly glad when I looked at what you are planning in the forthcoming book is that you said you're going to use examples from Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, Ecuador, Turkey, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And I was particularly glad about the inclusion of the United Kingdom in this, because when I made this program, I had an entire program on Boris Johnson and his attitude to the rule of law and the British Constitution and the courts. And needless to say, I was pulled up by people who were reviewing the series in the Times and things like that, saying, why did they include Boris Johnson and Britain in this? This is absolutely outrageous, you know, because of course we are exceptional, as everyone knows. And but while making these programs, I became fascinated by the fact that all of them, Trump was a very interesting example, I thought, were targeting structures of the judicial system from a pretty early stage. And so I'm really fascinated to hear your extremely erudite and systematic approach, as opposed to my sort of usual flitty journalistic approach. So Kim, please, if you take the floor, I'll ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll have some questions from the floor.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate the introduction. And I should have actually I'm not doing the UK today, but Brexit, discuss, let's talk.
We can talk.
Exactly. So first of all, can you hear me? Am I echoing too much? It's okay. So first of all, I wanted to say how delighted I am to see so many familiar faces. This is a topic that is pretty depressing, except that I hope to give you a little bit of hope at the end. And so my title is Destroying Democracy by Law, which is the tentative title of this book that I'm finishing while I'm here. And the state of global democracy, well, how good things are now depends on how long a perspective you take. So this is a little picture. Can you all see the slides? Sometimes I know it's hard. Okay. This is a picture where the red shows you autocracies and the green and the blue shows you democracies. And if you look over a 100-year period, this goes from 1921 to 2021, and I apologize to the historians, we should never do this kind of counting. But still, if you just take a kind of big picture, you'll see, of course, over the course of the century, democracy has really triumphed. But if you look at the last 20 years from about 2000 on, you'll see that the lines start to wobble and the blue starts to get smaller. And that's the thing that people are talking about as the decline of democracy, if you look around the world now and you take some of the political science categorizations of regime types, it turns out the most common kinds of regimes in the world are what political scientists call electoral autocracies, which are regimes with competitive elections but no real chance of changing leaders. And in this last year, in 2023, the Varieties of Democracy Project, which is probably the most respected democracy rater among academics, said that the overall levels of democracy in the world had gone from, in 2023, were now back to where they were in 1989, sort of at the beginning of the democratic euphoria, particularly in this part of the world. So who are the democratic backsliders? Well, this is another VDEM picture, Varieties of Democracy picture. And one way to understand this is that they have what's called a liberal democracy index. And it registers things like checks and balances, separation of powers, independence of the judiciary, plus protection of civil liberties. It's the kind of category that we might think of as just sort of adherence to constitutional values. And this is a chart that shows you the liberal democracy scores of like every country in the world along the horizontal axis in 2009 and along the vertical axis in 2019. If a country didn't change, it should just be on the line. And if a country got better, it should be above the line. And this is 2019, so Tunisia is not there now, right? You can see it. Okay, but the countries below the line were all the ones getting worse. So if you want some more granular sense of where this is happening, it's happening in a huge range of countries. And what's kind of striking is that there are more backsliders kind of in the top half of the scale than in the bottom half of the scale. Many of those are countries that will be familiar: Poland, Hungary, Serbia, Turkey. As of 2019, in some cases, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, they've gotten worse since then. The US is also a backslider up there, and despite the fact that there was an election since that time, the scores have actually not gotten that much better. So the question is how that happens. So once you see the backsliders, you know, how did they backslide? How did they wind up becoming less committed to democracy? And it turns out the old script, the old way democracies used to fail, was through coups. Now here's a little map that shows you the attempted coups in gray and the actual successful coups in red over time from 1950 to 2016. And what you'll see is that the area that's kind of shaded in gray is where all the coups are, which is the Cold War. You know, a lot of those are proxy coups or engineered by the US or the USSR. And at the end of the Cold War, coups really go way down. And there's a few. Last year was a bad year for coups, but in general, this is not the way that democracies fail. So what's going on in all these countries that are backsliding? It's mostly not this picture. It's instead this picture, which is separation of powers, or what we might call checks and balances, are being eroded slowly. Well, not always slowly, but they're being eroded by leaders who get elected. So the way democracies fail now is that a leader gets elected and starts chipping away at separation of powers, either the ability of the legislature to check the executive or of the judiciary to check either one. And so what you see is that systematically checks on the executive branch are dismantled. Again, going back to VDEM, which does a lot of counting of this stuff, they have reported that since 1990, 70% of all the major extensions of executive power were done by law. And half of those were done without even changing the law, just by reinterpreting what existing law in the books said. And so what we're seeing now is that a country's not in trouble just when there are tanks in the streets. Country's in trouble when there are lots of lawyers in the streets, okay? So, in other words, lawyers are the new soldiers of autocracy. This is not to put down all lawyers, as you will see at the end. I think lawyers have a special role to play in fixing this. But this is really the sign that things are going badly wrong, that the law is being changed and stretched, and everything is legal, okay? Which is why people may not be so excited, because if you read the academic literature about death of democracy and what's happening, you walk into a bookstore and this is what you see, right? Everybody is writing about populism. The people have gone crazy, right? The people have turned populist. And why have they turned populist? Because economic dislocation from globalization has created some people permanently left behind. There's fake news, manipulation of truth, so it's ignorance. fear of immigrants, anger at elites, racism. I mean, you know the drill. You've heard all this. But I want to say, I don't think populism is actually the problem, or at least it's not the main problem here. Populism, and frankly the academics who study populism, tend to focus on what these new autocrats say and how they appeal to publics. But what they don't often do is focus on what these new autocrats are doing. And what the autocrats are doing, the successful ones that stay in power for a long time, are usually engaged in some kind of constitutional destruction. And appeals to populism and constitutional destruction are not actually the same thing. And so blaming the public for what's happening, I think, doesn't really begin to capture what's going on here. Let me give you a little opinion data. So this is from the Pew Global Attitude Survey. I picked 2016 because that's the year of Brexit, actually, and the year of Trump. And so you ask people what one of the leading indicators of populism is, right? So does having diverse people in this country make our country a better place or a worse place? So the populists are the ones in orange here. And actually in the US, there were very few people who said that having a lot of people not like me make this country worse off in the year that Trump was elected. But you look through some of the other countries, and that kind of tracks what you probably expect. This was the year after the great migration crisis in Europe, so of course you get a lot of this attitude in Greece and Italy, the places that were hit. Of course, the Hungarian government was whipping up a lot of this kind of populist anger. So you see, demonstrable percentages of the public getting very excited about, being very concerned, I guess, about diversity. But here's a survey the year later, many of the same countries, and it asks a slightly different question. Would a system in which a strong leader can make decisions without interference from parliament or the courts be a good or bad way of governing the country? Okay. Now here, the green is the bad. Green is autocracy. And support for autocracy is pretty low everywhere. I mean, not workable electoral majorities, right? And it's very low in some of the countries that actually had pretty high populism scores, right? Which is to say there's something going on here, that the people who were voting for or have, some kind of susceptibility to populist appeals are not necessarily also in favor of crashing their democracy and having a strong man take over, right? These are different attitudes. So therefore, what I want to do here is to focus on what leaders do when they're in power. And this, for me, means turning our attention to law. So I have a very simple definition of democracy that I use in this talk, which is democracy. You have a democracy when you can change leaders through free and fair elections with peaceful transfers of power. I annoy a lot of my democratic theory colleagues for not having a more elaborate definition, but that kind of tracks, I think, what most people think democracy is. And you have autocracy when that's no longer possible, when the elections are rigged, when there's violence that accompanies the transfer of power, or when just the elections really close off the possibility of rotation of power by law. Okay, now why does it matter that we focus on law? So there's a chapter in my book called Law is the Way the State Talks to Itself. Now, what do I mean by that? So if you think about how law works, one of the things law does is it gives commands to people who work in the state bureaucracy. It gives commands to judges. It gives commands to the military. And there may be people who, in all of those groups, who might say, gee, I don't think this is the right thing to do. But then they say, but it's legal, so I must. Right? So the way that you capture the state, the courts, the military, all of the legally constituted offices in a state is by giving them legal direction. Right? So it matters how these autocrats are changing the law. Right? Law is the way the state talks to itself. So what I'm going to do is focus in a bit today on several countries to show you exactly how this works in more detail. I actually had slides on all of these countries, so if you want to ask me about all of them, please do, or about the UK, which I didn't include here, but which is in the book. But what you see when you get these autocrats that come to power is that some of them flail around and say a lot of bad things, and then they're voted out of office. Trump, Bolsonaro, for example. And then there are others who come to power, and they really double down on changing the law. And those are the ones you can't get rid of. So that's the story that I want to tell you today. Now, what's the script? So here's what you're looking for. So when somebody who might be an autocrat comes to power, what do? And they all do all these things, maybe slightly different in slightly different orders, but this is kind of the script. So what's striking is that all these new autocrats win elections that are free and fair the first time. That's how they get into office. That's often with these populist appeals, which is why I think the study of populism has taken off. But they aim their legal reforms at dismantling checks on executive power. To do that, they need to find some way to make the parliament either just a rubber stamp or irrelevant, right? And so that's going to be crucial. Capturing the courts, court reform is a very big part of this. Often it comes first. And that either happens by limiting the powers of courts by law, or by changing the way judges are appointed and packing the courts with your own appointees. What else? Ensuring that loyalists are in key positions, turning what had been independent agencies and offices into ones that are dependent on or loyal to the new autocrat. And there's particular offices they want to capture. So the prosecution authority, the authority that does tax enforcement, judicial selection, election administration, military intelligence services, those are the ones the autocrat needs to be able to stay in power. Okay. So those offices get packed with loyalists, often for extended terms of office. Harnessing the media as an echo chamber. So there's a lot of work on disinformation, on the lack of pluralism in the media in some of these countries that are going through autocratization. That's really crucial, and that's often done by law. Okay, harassing opposition parties and the civil sector to discourage and distract them, dividing and conquering, and in various ways defunding or passing laws that make their activities suddenly illegal or the actions of foreign agents. And then finally, or as part of this whole package, rewriting the election laws so that election number 2 is not as free and fair as election number 1, and by election 3, it's usually over. Okay, so that's the script. That's the stuff you're looking for as the danger signals. And there are 3 different ways the script can be written. I'm going to give you kind of one example of each today. This can be done slowly, sort of gradually over a variety of steps over many years so that the cumulative total isn't so evident on each individual step. Or it can be done in blitz fashion, all at once. Every single law is introduced within a couple of year period, and there's so much going on that the opponents can't really keep track. And then there's what I call autocracy on the fence, which is where you get some moves toward autocratization, then the thing kind of moves a little bit back in the other direction, and then you get another move toward autocratization, but it doesn't completely go off a cliff into autocratization. And there's a number of countries where that happens. I think the US under Trump is one of those, Brazil under Bolsonaro. I think Romania has been a really interesting case where you think it's going to die, and then it comes back, and then it hurdles off a cliff again. So there are a number of countries where you get these moves toward autocratization pulled back. Okay, so 3 different scripts. So let me start with the fast one. Hungary, my favorite. All right, so all my Hungarian friends here in the front are laughing because they know, of course, I'm going to talk about Hungary. All right, so Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been in power since 2010. He also had another prior term in office when he had to govern in coalition, so he governed very differently. And you all know his quote about turning Hungary into an illiberal state. Now, how did he get elected? This is one of the things I get fascinated by, is how do these autocrats get elected the first time fair and square, right, in a free and fair election? And Hungary, like it turns out almost every country that elects these people with autocratic ambitions, has a highly disproportionate election law. And this disproportionate election law meant that parties that won pluralities in the election would get majorities in the parliament. It was designed that way deliberately at the beginning because when the transition happened, when the election law was written in 1989 and 90, people thought there would be 1 million tiny parties, and the worry was being able to form a stable government. So they created a law that meant that whoever got the most votes, even if it wasn't close to a majority, would be able to form governments. So the law was designed to be disproportionate. And at the same time, in the Hungarian constitutional system, it's very easy to amend the constitution. A single 2/3 vote of the unicameral parliament is enough to change anything in the Constitution. And in 2010, some of you will remember that election, it was a terrible year for Hungary. The country had gone bankrupt. It was under an IMF austerity program. There was a caretaker government. The Liberal Party had collapsed. The socialists were discredited. Frankly, when Fidesz won the election in 2010, many of us breathed a sigh of relief that the neo-Nazi party Jobbik hadn't done even better, right? Because those were the choices. This was the result of the 2010 election. Orange is Viktor Orban's color. His party won 53% of the seats in this election in which essentially all the other organized parties had collapsed. And he got 68% of the seats in the parliament. 53% of the vote to 68% of the seats. That's the original sin of Hungarian constitutional law. And the other parties obviously did much worse, but they got even less than their proportion of the vote. Viktor Orban called this a revolution of the ballot box, and this justified everything that came later. And then the question is, so how did he take over the country and do it so quickly? So the first thing to know, this is, if you've been to Budapest, you know this building. This is the parliament. It's a bicameral building with a unicameral parliament inside. There's a history. Discuss. I will tell if you ask questions, we have an expert here. And so Hungary has a unicameral parliamentary system, which means the prime minister is elected by the parliament, the president is elected by the parliament. There are very few checks on this parliament, and it's unicameral, so there's not even an upper chamber to reject what the lower chamber has done. Basically, the only check on this system was the Constitutional Court that started operation in 1990. Those of you who have been following Israel, it's the same story, right? Unicameral parliamentary government with the courts is the only check. It's a vulnerable kind of system if you get the wrong people in power, and so Orban did that. So what does he do? His first move is to try to capture the Constitutional Court because it's the only thing that can tell him no, right? So right away, I mean, within the first couple of months, he changed the system for appointing judges so that his 2/3 majority in the parliament was enough to elect judges without any input from opposition parties. Then, why don't we have more judges, right, packing the court? So he increased the number of judges from 11 to 15. There's a link with Turkey, which I'll mention later. Changes the jurisdiction of the court so it gets out of the way on budget and fiscal matters. And then it used to be the case that anyone could send a case to the Constitutional Court for review. I mean, anyone in this room could have written a letter saying, you know, the law they passed last week violates Article 57, discuss, and that was a case. All of that went away so that the only people who could bring cases in an abstract fashion to the court were offices under Orban's control. The Constitutional Court tried to fight back as it was being packed. So Orban's parliament would pass a law, the Constitutional Court would say, no, you can't do that. They'd pass another law, the Constitutional Court would say, no, you can't do that as it's being packed. Finally, when they got to the point of having a majority of judges on the court in 2013, they passed this comprehensive constitutional amendment that took all the laws that the Constitutional Court had declared unconstitutional, put them into the Constitution, and then said, and the court cannot rule on constitutional amendments. And the court was packed. By 2013, it was basically all over, and the court has acted as a rubber stamp ever since. In the meantime, in 2011, Orban's government came out with this draft constitution, brand new constitution, written in secret. Nobody still knows really who the authors are. It was debated, I think, 8 days in the parliament. Written behind closed doors, no public or opposition participation, passed on a party line vote. Little technical thing for all the lawyers in the room. It was introduced as a private member's bill. Okay, now many of you know that in parliamentary procedure there's normal government bills that have to go through various stages of consultation. And then there can be bills that are just introduced by individual MPs, which often have the ability to kind of skip a lot of the stages of consultation because it's assumed that they probably won't pass if it's just one MP bringing it up. So a lot of Orban's reforms they introduced with Fidesz members, his party members, as private members' bills just to skip the parliamentary procedure. And the Constitution was introduced in that way. The Constitution, actually, when you read it, it's not that terrible. I mean, there are terrible things have been added to it, but they knew that was going to be scrutinized by a kind of international community. So there are many places in the Constitution where it says, and the remainder will be filled in by law, like the details will be filled in by law. These laws that the Constitution requires the Parliament to pass with a different two-thirds majority are called cardinal laws in Hungarian. And the Constitution required more than 50 of them. And that was where a lot of the consolidation of power happened. These were long, they were detailed, only a lawyer could read them. And these also required this two-thirds majority. What it means is that this whole constitutional system, including all of these very detailed laws setting up the constitutional order, must remain in place as long as Orban's people still have 1/3 of the seats in the parliament. So even if an opposition were to, by some miracle, get through Orban's election laws and win, as long as Orban retains 1/3 of the seats, he can block changes to any of these laws. Okay, so this was the structure. Here were some topics of these laws. Political parties, churches, the press, voting, minorities, military, on the parliament, on the presidency, on regulatory agencies, judiciary. I mean, everything about the constitutional system was regulated in detail in these laws, which were designed to constantly point power back at the center. For example, there was a cardinal law creating a media council, also a media authority. It was introduced in 2011. All the members of this media authority are appointed by a 2/3 vote of the parliament. What could be wrong with that? You know, in most countries, a 2/3 vote of the parliament means you got to get the agreement of other parties. Not in Hungary after that election, right? So this council has been actually now for more than a decade, finding media outlets that are not providing fair and balanced news coverage. And they can deny broadcast frequencies. They've really presided over the destruction of pluralism in the Hungarian media. This is just a graph that shows you public opinion data from Hungarians who say, so do the media in this country have a lot of freedom or not? And it went from 87% in 2010 when Orban came to office down to 37% by 2018, which is to say the media is an echo chamber. Look at the judiciary, because the judiciary is very often, you know, what gets hit first. And here, what the government did was to create a new office called the National Judicial Office, which is in charge of hiring, firing, removing, promoting, disciplining judges. Every aspect of a judge's career is covered by this office, which was headed by this person, who actually had 2 deputies, and I think that was it in the office, which is to say the whole process of controlling the judiciary was very centralized around a close friend of the prime minister's, whose husband, by the way, had written the Constitution, was the only one that we know was for sure writing the Constitution. And so this person, the judiciary, was picking new judges, was entirely centralized. And so then they needed judgeships to fill. So what did the government do? They lowered the judicial retirement age from 70 to 62, knocked out, well, probably about 10% of the judges, disproportionately the ones higher up, because it's a civil service judiciary, like in most of Europe, where you start at the bottom and you work your way up. So it was 1/4 of the Supreme Court, 50% of the appeals court presidents created these vacancies to be filled by this person. The role of judges in judging their peers, which is kind of a standard practice in Europe, was greatly diminished. And then, you know, as the courts were also sort of trying to fight back through this period, so they kept changing and amending these laws. Most recently, in 2021, a new president of the Supreme Court was appointed, who was parachuted in from the Constitutional Court, which is all appointed by the parliament, so no peer review of judges. And now he's been given the power to assign any case to any judge. Right, so he comes in, sees the case. If it's something the government cares about, he assigns it to a friendly judge, and he can change the panels. And plus, he's been given the power to expand his court by 25%. So that's how it goes. All right, Orban cut the size of the parliament in half, which meant that he got to redistrict the whole country at once. Massive gerrymandering has meant that it's been impossible for the opposition to win really any election since that time. I mentioned the cutting short parliamentary procedure with private members' bills. All of these independent offices, from the prosecution, audit, ombudsman, central bank, everything has been captured by loyalists whose terms of office have been extended, often 9 years, sometimes 12 years, all reporting back to Orban. Basically what's happened is that everything is legal except what Orban himself does. right? Which is to say, he has this regular parliamentary majority. He's won 4 consecutive elections, because after the first one, all the other ones were rigged. And he can amend the Constitution at will with his 2/3 vote. But even that wasn't enough. When the pandemic started, Orban declared a state of emergency in March 2020, which persists to this day. They switched it so after a while the pandemic failed, and now it's a state of emergency because there's a war in Ukraine. The state of emergency that's been in place since March 2020 allows Orban to override any law by decree. So every day there's like a decree overriding. There's no legal certainty whatsoever left in Hungary. And so everybody agrees, and the Parliament passed a resolution, European Parliament passed a resolution last September. Hungary is no longer a full democracy. There is just no way this counts any longer. And it was this blitz. It was mostly over by 2013, and then they've been mopping up, some of the resistors ever since. But this kind of, hitting every institution at once meant that every single institution that was attacked tried to protect itself and had no energy left over to protect any of the others. And so you see that blitz, and I can, talk about this in the questions. This is what's happening in Israel now. As Netanyahu's government is kind of shoveling through not just the judicial reforms, but a whole series of other reforms that are aimed to sort of cut off all the independent voices that might have any institutional toehold against his government. This happened in Venezuela, where Chavez comes in, rewrites the constitution, does it all at once in a few years. And those blitz kind of operations, people don't always understand what's happening in the middle of it. They can see after the fact when they're stuck. But at the time, it's such a frenzy of lawmaking, it's hard to keep track. So that's the fast version. Let me give you a slower version. I'm going to give you the example of Turkey. I could have talked about Russia. So Mr. Erdogan has been in power since 2002. And the system that he inherited, the constitutional system he inherited, included the sort of constitutionally mandated secularism, going back to Ataturk and the founding of the Turkish Republic. And this mandatory secularism in a Muslim majority country where people were pretty religious was enforced by the constitutional court and the military. So every time it looked like there was going to be an Islamist sort of uprising, the court would declare it unconstitutional, the military would have a coup. I mean, this was why Turkey's democracy was so fragile. And so Erdogan comes along, and his party, the AKP, the Justice and Development Party. By the way, everyone from this part of the world knows this, right? When a party has the word justice in its title, yeah, okay, it usually is bad news, right? Okay, so here too, in Turkey, so this party comes across as a moderate Islamist party. It escapes the party bans that were not only in Turkish law, but upheld by the European Court of Human Rights, that a party that threatens the constitutional order can be banned. So his party looked more moderate. He was actually able to stand for election and to actually put his party up. They were liberal enough to escape this kind of party ban system. Erdogan's elected mayor of Istanbul in 1995. By 2002, he's running his party in a national election, and this is the result. So his party gets 34% of the vote in 2002. What's interesting, I go back and I read the election monitors' reports from these elections that bring autocrats to power. And here they said, look, the playing field was kind of tilted against Erdogan. Therefore, his victory, all the more remarkable, was probably pretty fair, right? And they also found the 2010 election in Hungary fine, too. So here's the thing about Turkish elections. Until actually this year, a political party had to get 10% of the vote to get into parliament. Okay? And what that meant was, again, just like in Hungary, with a minority of the vote or without a supermajority of the vote, you can get supermajorities of seats in the parliament, because if every single party that gets less than 10% is knocked out of the possibility of getting seats, it magnifies the victory of the plurality winner. Same disproportionality problem. We're going to see this over and over again. I can give you actually the UK has the same problem, right? A lot of these countries that actually magnify pluralities are the ones that have been most vulnerable to having these autocrats winning elections, actually. And here's another example. So when Erdogan's party got the most votes, he gets 34% of the vote. In 2002, he wins 66% of the seats in the parliament. Okay, that's what gets him into power. And that means that 2/3 of the public voted for somebody else and yet get almost a 2/3 majority in the parliament. Okay, so he becomes prime minister. At this stage, Turkey has a parliamentary system where the parliament then elects the leader. And at first, some of you may remember this, at first Erdogan looked like a good guy, right? He applies for membership in the EU. The EU recognizes Turkey's candidacy. A lot of the reforms that Erdogan did in those first several years were actually sort of human rights respecting ones. He eliminates the death penalty, entrenches gender equality, strengthens civilian control over the military, cracks down on torture, actually eliminates the military commissions for civilians, does a whole bunch of stuff to comply with European Court of Human Rights decisions. And these formal accession talks are launched, and people are saying, he's a Democrat, he's a good guy. When I talk about this slow autocracy, there's very often this kind of honeymoon phase. There was also for Putin, by the way, if you think about how Russia developed. Didn't last forever. Excuse me. As it turns out, this is a chart that shows you the percentage of Europeans in favor of Turkey's membership in the EU, and the answer was, it was never very high. European public opinion was not much in favor of Turkey joining. And once Cyprus joined, without resolving the partition, Cyprus then said it would veto Turkey's membership, and the accession talks came to a halt. What happens? You see Erdogan start to pivot, and this is the beginning of the autocratic move. So it's a busy slide. The gist of what happens here is that he gets to appoint the parliament elects the president and also the prime minister. So he appoints someone who's quite religious into the presidency, which is usually a signal to the constitutional court and the military, get nervous about Islam, it's coming. Excuse me. So the military threatens to intervene. Constitutional court refuses to certify this candidate. Erdogan calls a snap election and wins more of the vote. And then introduces a constitutional amendment to change the system for choosing the president so it's by popular vote and not by the parliament. Okay, so it's step one, but he has to put up this religious figure to get the public out there and to trigger the court and the military. So this guy becomes president. Okay, now the president's sort of a figurehead, but that's just the beginning. And that was 2007. In 2010, another package of constitutional amendments. And often what happens in these slow takeovers is that the aspirational autocrat will introduce a bunch of things that look really good and are very popular with a bunch of things that are very technical and disastrous. Okay, and that's what happened. So suddenly, with this package of constitutional amendments, Erdogan says, okay, individual citizens can now go to the constitutional court to realize their rights. What could be wrong with that, right? And then we're going to have to increase the number of judges on the constitutional court to handle all these new cases, right? Isn't that good? We're going to support the court. And this system allows him to pack the constitutional court, right? And people vote for it. So this is like a popular that goes to the public. People vote for it. Who doesn't want their rights improved? Who doesn't want more judges to hear the cases? This also included bringing the military under Erdogan's thumb by removing their exemption from standing trial for abuses. Okay, and again, who could be opposed to accountability? Okay, so with this package of constitutional amendment, what happens is that Erdogan gains control over the constitutional court and the military, the two forces that might stand up against him. Right? It's very targeted, exactly who can tell him no. Again, a busy slide. There were these huge trials, two immense trials, one in 2012, one in 2013, the first involving 330 military officers, the second involving 247. They were show trials with made-up evidence, as we all now know, but they took the leadership of the military and put them on trial for various atrocities that the military had committed, convicted them all, which disables the whole, top level of the military. And then, after they're all gotten rid of, after the military has really been fundamentally remade, then the appeals courts say, oh, by the way, they were show trials, and we're going to acquit everybody on appeal. Okay, but that he didn't care that all these guys were in prison. He just cared that they weren't in the military anymore. And by that time, by the time all these court processes happened, he had disabled the military. And again, those were the two things he had to disable in order to kind of clear the way for himself. So then how does he clear the way for himself? Okay, so the next thing is that he could see that his party was starting to lose traction in the public. So how do you overcome this in a parliamentary system? He has to keep getting parliamentary majorities to keep winning elections. So he's personally popular, but his party isn't. So he, again, as a result of that earlier episode where he put up the friend to be the president, the constitutional amendment now allows the president to be elected by popular vote. So in 2014, Erdogan runs for president. Okay, it's a figurehead job, but he gets elected as president. Sure enough, the next year his party loses its parliamentary majority. Okay, it's a snap election, he gets it back. And then he's president, not prime minister. He has a puppet prime minister. And then there's this coup attempt, which many of you will recall. We still don't really know where it came from or what was behind it, but it gave Erdogan the opportunity to crack down on everything. So these are the numbers of people who were fired: teachers, education ministry officials, police, soldiers. This is members of the judiciary that fired 3,000 judges, 1,500 university professors. I mean, so you go through all of this. This was a purge of all the institutions of Erdogan's opponents. And the coup gave him an opportunity to do it legally. All right, so what happens? This is the final blow. So remember, he's now president, not prime minister. But the presidency is a shell, right? It's just a placeholder. Now what he has to do is to move all the powers that were in the prime minister's job into the presidency. And that was the effect of this set of 2017 amendments held during a state of emergency after the coup. And so this does a whole bunch of different things. It converts Turkey from a parliamentary to a presidential system. Okay, it gets rid of the prime minister and gives the president huge powers to make law by decree. So it makes a super presidency, which Erdogan is sitting in, gives him 2 more terms, and gives this president control over judicial careers. The referendum passes, oops, sorry, that was weird, during a state of emergency, and suddenly what you've got is this super presidency. There's an election coming up in 2 weeks. This is why I wanted to talk about Turkey today, because the question is whether he's going to win another term. Okay, these are some of the opinion polls from January, February, March of this year. Erdogan is in blue, his main opponent is in red, and what you're seeing is that it's a neck-and-neck contest. So what has Erdogan been doing? He's been changing the election law. So they lowered the threshold for parliamentary elections from 10% to 7%, which means that they're trying to break up the coalitions that are organized against him, changing the composition of election boards. It's a lot of technical changes, but what it does is it puts the administration of the election more firmly in the hands of Erdogan's supporters, and many people believe that even if the other guy gets more votes, the election boards won't find that. Right, so the chances of this being a free and fair election are not that high. And so what we have, step by step, right, first you get the elected presidency, then you disable the court and the military, then you start moving more powers into the presidency, then you convert the whole system. This is how you get an autocrat, but slowly, step by step. So we can talk about Russia. I think this is what's happening in Turkey. All right. Okay, I have to talk about America, in part because everybody says, why don't you say these things about your own country? And the answer is I do. So these were the headlines the day after Trump won, both in Germany and in the US. Nobody thought Trump was going to win in 2016, and there he was. We shouldn't have been surprised. So here's the results of a Gallup poll. The dark green tells you the percentage of Americans who are satisfied with the way the nation is being governed. And basically, since 9/11, these numbers have been underwater, regardless of who's president, actually. So they don't seem to change that much you know, depending on whether you have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, there's been massive discontent with government. And the state of democracy in the US as measured, this is the Freedom House measure, but if you do the VDEM measure, it had been going down for some time, actually, even before Trump. Trump was elected, those of you who followed the campaign may recall, you know, everyone, this is when people start wanting, you know, a lot of academics and journalists want to talk about populism, all of his appeals, all the nasty things he's saying. And then there was a thought, well, if he's elected, maybe he'll become more presidential. Maybe he would not be that dangerous. Now, the 2016 election, these elections that bring the aspirational autocrats to power, I think, are always really interesting to watch. The question is, how come these folks win the first time, right? And so this was a poll done a couple months before that 2016 election. The top shows you the percentage of Trump voters who were voting for Trump for different reasons, and the majority were voting against Hillary. And the bottom, Hillary Clinton, remember she was running, the bottom take the Hillary Clinton supporters and say, why are you voting for her? And the majority of her voters are voting against Trump, right? Which is to say you had two massively unpopular candidates, each outdoing each other on negatives, basically, which is not a great way to run a democracy. And as you recall, actually, if the US ran elections like most countries and just counted votes, Hillary Clinton would have won. She actually got 3 million more votes than Trump. But we have this crazy thing called the Electoral College. Ask me about it. I can go on for a long time about it. It means that basically we have 50 state elections that are added up separately, and by that count, this was how Trump wins. Again, it's interesting, right? Because in Hungary and in Turkey and also in the US, there's this disproportionality thing that happens where the person who actually wins the election is not the majority vote getter. And all three of those systems made that possible. And it turns out when you look through a lot of these systems, that's a kind of persistent feature of some of these elections that bring the autocrats to power. So who wins? So what were Americans voting for? So here's a survey from 2017, again, a year into Trump. Americans are asked, so how important is it to you that national elections are open and fair, that we have a system of checks and balances, that people have the right of nonviolent protest, et cetera? And overwhelming percentages of Americans still believe all that stuff, including, of course, a lot of people who must have voted for Trump. That's way in excess of the percentage that voted for Trump. And Trump never had majority support. Still does not, in the public as a whole, okay? So something else gets him into power, and it's the weird American electoral system. And so what a lot of Americans say, and this is actually to echo what Misha said earlier, Americans, like Brits, think they've had the oldest democracies on the planet, so what could go wrong, right? But if you think about how the American system is organized, the checks and balances that everybody learns about in their civics classes in America says, well, Congress checks the president and the court checks both of them and so on. But it turns out that if you have a political party where loyalty to party exceeds loyalty to the institution that those folks are in, if the Republicans in Congress are going to support a Republican president no matter what, and judges appointed by Republican presidents are going to support the Republican no matter what, and you carry that down to the state level, where the Republican governors and attorneys general and state legislatures support the Republican no matter what, all of American checks and balances disappear because they rely on Congress checking the president and the states checking the center and the courts checking them all. And once you start getting partisan affiliation mattering more than institutional loyalty, there's a real danger. There's another real danger hardwired into the American system, which is that it relies extremely heavily on unwritten conventions and norms, just like the UK, right? This is where I keep saying the US may look like it has a more entrenched constitutional system, but actually it doesn't. And one of the most shocking features of this is that the control of the executive branch, and again, all these autocracies happen when the executive branch swallows everything else, right? So that's where you need your controls. Article 2 of the US Constitution, which lays out what the president's supposed to do, says very little, actually. And so most of the law of the executive branch consists of confidential memos written by the White House counsel's office or the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department telling the president what he can and can't do. And because those memos are legal advice, they're actually secret. Yes. So the U.S. executive branch is mostly governed by secret law. This is just one of those little secrets that we don't teach in constitutional law typically. It's also extremely hard to sue the president for anything, given the way the courts are set up. So the legal constraints on the president are not something that is susceptible to public accountability or judicial accountability. It's always been a danger in the system, and that danger is there. And when you have an attorney general, as a sequence of them, actually, as Trump had, all of whom are dedicated to preserving his presidency and telling him what he wanted to hear, that check disappears. Okay, this is not a really exciting chart, but this was a little measure from the Varieties of Democracy about executive respect for the constitutional order. And it turns out it was true. Under Trump, the U.S. did worse than either under Nixon during Watergate or at the height of the War on Terror, both episodes where we think the president, shall we say, rather exceeded their mandate. It's still not a huge fall, actually. I mean, Trump did damage, but he didn't actually break the constitutional system. He said a lot of terrible things. Some of you will remember some of these terrible things. You know, they weren't all Nazis, you know, in Charlottesville, et cetera. He openly celebrated violence. I just put together a collection of his quotes praising various people who had body slammed his, you know, his opponents or whatever, his stand back and stand by to the Proud Boys militia. He was constantly doing this kind of stuff, which is what made everybody really upset. But what was interesting was that Trump changed very little law. He didn't have the patience, he didn't have the training. This may have really saved the United States, I think. He improvised. He put unqualified people into jobs. He refused to fill a lot of positions. He refused expert advice. He shut down the government, which kind of backfired on him. He played fast and loose with classified information. Mostly, he just gummed up the works. You know, he's like good soldiers fake, right? It's just like constantly messing stuff up. I called this, with like my co-author David Posen, executive underreach. Right? So, in other words, rather than overreaching and grabbing all the power he could, like Erdogan and Orban, Trump does the opposite. He just keeps dropping stuff on the floor, right? Like just not filling a job. Like the whole State Department, the 6th and 7th floors of all the deputy secretaries and whatever, they just didn't fill those jobs through most of the Trump administration. Excuse me. There were a couple places where he used the law, but mostly he did not use the law to lock in his power. He even had a support of Congress in the first couple of years of his term, pushed a few laws through, mostly a giant tax cut, then nothing. But he loved executive orders. Here's one. You know, he was constantly signing them and showing them off, you know. Excuse me. He also signed lots of things that had no legal force whatsoever. The website of the White House had this little section. You can go look at the archive called Presidential Actions, you know, where he just declares things, and you could see that it has like the lawyers were looking at this like this isn't a law, right? This isn't even a decree. So he was issuing a lot of decrees, but mostly he was ignoring the law, except in some areas where some of his loyalists took over, like in the Environmental Protection Agency, in immigration. There were a couple of areas where some of his loyalists made a flurry of new rules. Excuse me. But mostly, Trump was not the legal type. The big place where he had an effect, of course, was in the judiciary. He outsourced this to others. He didn't really care, right? And so basically, he nominated a quarter of the federal bench, a third of the Supreme Court. These are judges that have been distinctive, disruptive, significantly more conservative, and are ripping up the law. That's a big effect. But that was, again, he just delegated that to somebody else. I will go through shadow docket. And then in the 2020 election, what was interesting here was that the people who voted for Trump by that time, sorry, I have a tree pollen allergy, and here we go. The people who voted for Trump mostly voted for Trump because they liked him. And the people who voted for Biden were mostly not voting for Trump. This is why Biden might win the next time. You saw he declared today for presidency. All right, so was this a close election? Well, no, actually. That's not a close election. Biden got, I think, 6 million, 7 million more votes than Trump. The Electoral College wasn't close. But of course, this was Trump's attempt to stay in power. He kept saying the election was stolen. You all remember this, and you'll all remember this. excuse me, when his supporters came out and attacked the Capitol on the day that they were going to be counting the Electoral College votes. And we've learned since that time that there was much more going on. This is where I think you're probably going to see some indictments coming down the road. Behind all of this was this legal plot cooked up by a bunch of his lawyers and some academics to try to keep Trump in power by using some weird, sort of vague elements of something called the Electoral Count Act. But there was a legal plot behind it. In other words, the Capitol was sort of the thing for show. What they were planning to do was to actually get fake electors certified and to flip the results of the Electoral College. And I think what we're seeing now is that there are going to be a series of indictments of Trump for various kind of election manipulation. That said, people think the danger is Trump. The danger in the US is actually, I hate to say it, because every decent democracy needs a decent conservative party, right? So this is not against conservatives. The Republican Party is now lining up a series of legal arguments that would do what Trump did not do, which is to consolidate power in Republican hands so that it never moves again. I won't go through all of these. I can talk about these in the questions. But they're teeing up a whole sort of autocratic, legalistic set of ideas that their judges are now primed to accept. So I think the U.S. is not only not out of danger, but it's getting worse. Is the U.S. still a democracy? Everybody's kind of on the fence. That's why I think the U.S. is not out of danger, but it's not collapsing yet. So these are the pathways to autocracy, the slow version, the fast version, the on-the-fence version. And I just want to end very quickly by saying, so now what I promised you, a slight bit of optimism. Okay, so the first thing is that when these kinds of things start, what political science is, what a lot of other political science research tells us is that the only thing that works is early mass public protest, like what's happening in Israel. It may not work in Israel, but it's really the only hope. That's what has happened in Romania. That's why I think Poland has not been worse than it's been. Hungary gave up too quickly. Dislodging autocracy once entrenched. Well, what you see is that the autocrats, if they stay in long enough, change the election laws so you can't get rid of them. So sometimes they're unlevel playing fields, but things aren't hopeless. I think that was true in Brazil last time. I think the U.S. isn't yet gone, although it's really an unlevel playing field. We've actually had 40 years of Supreme Court decisions in the U.S. that have supported Republican efforts to tilt the election in every single case. Turkey, we'll see in a couple of weeks whether that's too far gone. But in Russia, Hungary, Venezuela, elections just will not change anything at this stage. So if elections are no longer open to change, what changes things? Well, history tells us three things. One is economic collapse, because eventually these systems become economically not self-sustaining. Another is war. Let's see what happens with Russia in the current war. And the third is the death of the leader, because the thing about these autocrats is that they don't want a successor waiting in the wings. So what happens when they die, the system often kind of crashes. So if the public can change leaders, what happens next? And this is where I'm just going to leave you with a small bit of optimism. Just as you can destroy democracy by law, you can rebuild democracy by law. What constitutional scholars will tell you is you get a new leader, you call a constitutional convention, you write a constitution, and then you've got it. And I'm saying I don't think that's what you should do in these cases. We have a lot of resources in international law. International law meaning international human rights law, which tells you what judicial independence means, judicial human rights law around the right to vote and what a free and fair election would look like. It's not the same when a new government takes over and moves, and even sometimes breaking their national law, to move in the direction of complying with international standards. Not the same as having grabbed these powers and moved them away from international standards. So what I've been trying to encourage people is to think about what I call an asymmetric rupture. It's one thing to move back toward European norms, toward the norms of regional human rights bodies, and quite another thing to move away, and new governments can move toward this. So packing a court to make it independent of political branches is different than packing it to make it dependent. Changing election rules to make voting more universal and equal is not the same. So in other words, I'm trying to get around these tit-for-tat arguments, like they did it, so now we're going to do it, and isn't that equally bad? And the answer is no, it's not equally bad, right? And we have a kind of standard that allows you to demonstrate that. And so this is, I just mentioned this about where do these standards come from? I can go through, actually I'm giving a lecture at the University of Vienna on May 11th where I do this slide for a whole lecture, which is what are all the international standards, where do they come from, and how do you use them? And I'm just going to end here by just saying there will be hope in these systems. If you look at a country like Hungary or a country like Turkey or even a country like the US, I have a lot of hope that 20 years from now it'll be better. The question is how we get there, what's going to happen in the meantime, and whether it has to get worse before it gets better, and how we maintain some commitment to constitutionalism, democracy, and the rule of law in the next round of transitions. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Kim, that was excellent. Absolutely splendid, but it throws up as many questions as it answers.
I'm sure.
I want to start with a couple. First of all, you have the slow-fast mechanism. You also then mentioned the sober and the flamboyant, as it were. An interesting thing I thought is that the flamboyant ones, Trump, Bolsonaro, and Johnson, all, by their standards, lost.
Yeah.
And I think you explained why that was in your description of Trump, is that it's all about them. They're such extreme narcissists, right, and they're impatient, and they are liars, without even thinking about it, right, sort of habitual liars. And so they miss what Orban had, which was the systemic approach. Erdogan, somewhere in between, as it were, because as you pointed out, at first he was doing all the right things. I mean, the laws he passed were often very, very progressive and in accordance with what the European Union was asking. And then, of course, it all started to go bad, although there's an interesting point you make on Erdogan. I'm going to come to the point of my question in a sec. When you said, who wouldn't say it was a bad thing that you curbed the power of the military in Turkey? Well, frankly, who wouldn't say it was a bad thing that you curbed the power of the military in Turkey? Because they were the arbiters, and they were arbiters of caprice of Turkish democracy up until this point, and they needed to be curbed. So, I think that's something that it's hard to, in one sense, it's hard to criticize him for, although, Genekon, I agree with you, I think that's where you see what's really going on. But there's one thing which you haven't mentioned, and which I'm interested to see what you would say to, and that is the economy. Yeah. Orban, was very quick to identify the economic distress of 2008 and do something about it.
Exactly.
And I don't think 2016 could have happened in the UK or the US without 2008.
Right.
And the massive subsidies given to the banks, the austerity programs introduced, particularly in the United Kingdom after that. These were, I would say, a critical factor. Is that something that you're going to sort of introduce in your measurement of, how vulnerable systems are?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that, what's interesting about some of these systems, and the three I discussed, have all had really rocky last decades, economically speaking, and COVID was yet another one of those cases where, the economy just falls apart. So, these are leaders, if you take someone like Erdogan and someone like Orban, they're leaders who are pretty good at detecting national moods and where they're going and what they need to do. And they're populist in this good sense, right? If, if one of the things that populists are good at, right, is it making life better for the average person. Okay, now, in some cases, that also involves violating the law. So they have to change the law to be able to do it. So, excuse me, when Orban started giving out a lot of these massive subsidies in the early, 2000 teens, one of the things he had to do was disable the Constitutional Court from ruling on those things, because some of them were unconstitutional under the Constitution, including the one that he had passed. So again, the economic measures are sometimes at odds with the legal measures. And the economic measures can extend to, or how to put it, I mean, you look at these three, and all three of them did things that were progressive economically, right? So are they left-wing? Are they right-wing? Well, it becomes extremely hard to say when you compare their rhetoric and their economic policy, right? They sort of pull in different directions. What's interestingly happening now, though, is that in Hungary, as you know, the EU has now frozen probably about 30 billion euro to Hungary because of these rule of law issues. And you're starting to see the Hungarian government crack a little bit. So the president of the central bank is attacking the prime minister. So far it hasn't gotten very personal, but it's clear that the central banker is seeing something very different than what they're doing in the center. So all of this is a way of saying that, yes, sometimes these populist leaders can maintain themselves and keep themselves popular by having some of these economic sort of populist measures that keep people on side. But eventually their luck runs out, right? Because if you start to get a system which is entirely arbitrary, whereas in Hungary the law can be changed by decree from 1 minute to the next, what you start seeing is a queasiness of international investors. You start seeing a kind of, the economy is maintained, as we see in Hungary, by a sort of mafia-like shakedown of local companies. This is not a recipe for economic success. And Erdogan's had this trouble, printing lots of money into the pandemic and having the value of the currency drop again. So economies have different ways of judging the success of these measures than legality. And ultimately, I think sometimes these economies bring them down. I mean, that's what the only way I can see Orban really failing is if this lack of EU money that he would have to give out to his friends starts to dry up, and then his friends start to dry up or turn on him or whatever. So, economies have a way of not being very kind to autocrats in the long run, even if in the short run they might be able to patch together policies that keep them in play for a while.
Yeah, I mean, he's really, of all the ones you mentioned, the bigger group, he is, to my mind, by far the most successful. And that might have been to do with the speed, the timing of when he came, his systematic approach. It was a really smart way of doing things, let's face it, from his perspective. And none of the others have managed really to replicate that. And on your example of the United States, I mean, I think what you said at the end was absolutely critical, that the Republicans realized with Trump is that they had chosen someone, or someone had emerged, who wasn't capable of doing the job. And that job essentially is to keep, middle-aged white men in power against the wave of demographic change that is, this is a last throw of the dice for them. And so that's why it's so existential. Do you think that the United States, that the Republicans really can succeed with a program like that? And from an American perspective, because it's so important from the rest of the world, what are the ways, apart from mass demonstrations, because it hasn't yet happened, what are the ways that Democrats with a small d can intervene to save their republic, as it were?
Yeah, such a good question. So I actually work on this stuff in the U.S. too. Sorry. This is my tree pollen overcoming me. So what can Democrats do, small d Democrats do? Well, the first thing I think they have to do is to recognize that the way democracies die is by rigging the rules, not by winning, not by stuffing ballot boxes on election day, right? So the Democratic Party in the U.S. has built itself around the thought that there's nothing better turnout can't cure, right? And this is just the Democrats' go-to recipe. Sign up new voters, get them to the polls. It's really all about turnout because they know they have majorities. The majorities don't matter if the rules have been rigged so that majorities are not able to convert that into actually winning elections. So, for example, one of the things you see going through the Supreme Court right now, this is a live case on the docket of the Supreme Court, is judicial approval of something called the independent state legislature theory. Okay, what could sound more boring? Basically what this is the result of 40 years of Republican effort to get everybody, including Democrats, to read the Constitution of the United States literally. Literally according to the way the framers intended it, right? This kind of originalism. And anyway, so there's a line, there are two lines in the Constitution, one with respect to the presidency, one with respect to congressional elections, that says that the rules of federal elections shall be determined in such manner as the state legislature shall direct in each of the states, which means that American federal elections are 50 state elections added up. Okay, so what everyone has thought until now is that that means the state legislature as defined in its state constitution, right? State legislature, there's a court that oversees whether the laws are constitutional under the state constitution. There's a governor who can veto with it. Okay, so that was the view until Bush v. Gore. And then you start seeing this conservative scholarship coming up. The Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore said, you know, there's no individual right in the Constitution to vote for a president. You only have an individual right to vote for president if your state legislature gives you that right. So here's the trick. Suppose that there is an election like the one in 2000 where the result in Florida was just unclear. What happens then? And it turns out that what Republicans say is, well, the state legislature then decides what happens. And the state legislature can say, we'll decide who the electors are from our state. Okay? It turns out that in 27 of the states at the moment, Republicans dominate the state legislatures. In quite a few of those states, they have courts that are not captured and or Democratic governors. So if you want those state legislatures, many of which are heavily gerrymandered, and that's another story, if you want those state legislatures picking who the electors are for the presidency, then you need to muscle those courts and the governors out of the way. So this independent state legislature theory, thank you for bearing with me on a long technical explanation, basically says the Constitution of the United States only mentions state legislatures. It says nothing about governors and courts. So whatever the state legislature does is all that matters. And that is rigged, given the way Republicans have spent a lot of time rigging the state legislatures. I mean, the Democrats were not paying attention to this. If the Supreme Court adopts this theory, then if there is an election next time where you got a Republican majority, but the electorate slides in a Democratic direction, the Republican state legislature can override the popular vote with the approval of this Republican-packed Supreme Court.
And they can send Republican votes to the Electoral College, i.e.
Right. In other words, you can get the presidential election to be hardwired in favor of Republicans under this theory, even if you have an overwhelmingly Democratic vote. I hope I explained that. It's sort of technical, and that's why, you know, who understands that stuff, right? And so this is the kind of thing that the Republicans have been putting in place, and that's why it's so consequential that they captured the courts. Anyway, so I mean, I really think, I mean, the U.S. is way more in danger than I think most Americans realize, let alone most, you know, folks watching internationally. Yeah, it's really scary. And I think Britain is similarly in danger.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say about Britain, and it's an interesting point about populism, is that the Tories, the Brexiteers, made the big mistake of giving themselves an achievable goal. an achievable goal with incredibly negative consequences, which they now have to own.
Right.
And if you look at the Conservative Party now, it's actually in free fall. It's a collapsing party with incompetent leaders, and electorally it's wiping it. It is likely to wipe itself, if not wipe itself out, then seriously damaged. So that's something, and Roe versus Wade, in a funny sort of way, plays the same function in the United States. Right. The Supreme Court vote, Trump or DeSantis cannot repudiate it because so many of its base support it, and yet a lot of votes have shifted over to the Democrats as a consequence of that Supreme Court decision.
Right. But then this assumes free and fair elections, right? And the thing about British elections that are so wacky is that it's a first-past-the-post system in all these individual constituencies. The Tories may rewrite some of those constituencies before they leave office. This will give them a chance to gerrymander. That's why some of their electoral reform is dangerous. The other thing that they've laid as a trap in case they lose is this...
Trying to rig it. I'm slightly more optimistic about the UK. I mean, the place is in freefall, but it's the US which is where one really needs to focus one's attention because of the implications for everyone else. Who cares if the UK goes down the tube? No,
many of us care.
Only us. We care about it, but nobody else.
The EU is kind of saying, phew, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, that's had a very positive effect for the EU, because people look at the United Kingdom and say, actually, thanks, but no thanks. Right. I'm not going to untangle 40 years of regulatory harmony.
Right.
Anyway, sorry, I
most stable feature.
I must stop talking about Brexit.
Most stable.
Sorry, I
most stable feature.
I must stop talking about Brexit.
The most stable feature of the UK government is Larry the Cat.
I'm going to ask for some questions. I saw Paul Lentvine with his hand up. If you were able to introduce yourself, particularly for the audience outside the room, and then pose your question.
I had the honor of quoting Kim in my Orban biography. And everything what you said confirmed our joint thesis. You did something today. I don't think anywhere in the world anyone referred to Tunde Hando, whose picture you showed. Hungarians know the details. She was in the same college as Orban.
Yeah.
Her husband, Mr. Sayer, was the man who escaped from a homosexual party half naked and wrote also before that the constitution of Hungary. Yep. But I wanted to ask you, this what you showed...
You can't make this stuff up.
You can't accuse the EVM of being boring.
Right.
What you showed here confirms what my wife always quarrels with me if I say that Orban is extremely capable. There is no question. Mm-hmm. There is one thing where I disagree, that you have to correct it. He doesn't purge people. That is the real thing. He demotes them, then he brings them back again.
Right.
Number two,
that's true.
In a long time he didn't want any women. Now he has two sex attractive and who can speak languages. One of them, the Minister of Justice. So my question is, Kim, if something happens in Brussels and really Hungary gets into trouble economically, will, not the civil society, the economy, will Orban take off the gloves and will go the way Putin did? I am not sure that it will go to that extent, but that is, I think, a potential danger.
Such a good and depressing question. So one thing that EU membership does is I think it distinguishes Hungary and Turkey and Russia. So you can't fall that far and still be in the EU. There would be other measures I think the EU would take before it got to that stage. For me, the question actually, now that Brussels has taken this move of cutting almost all the funding to Hungary except the agricultural funds, is how far the Hungarian economy has to fall before it starts affecting the other economies in the EU, which will make the EU want to give Hungary the money so as not to bring anybody else down. That's, for me, the worry. Because you can't have a failed economy in the EU. Things are too interdependent. This is not Greece, so Hungary's not in the Eurozone, so it doesn't have that problem, but it's still an economically integrated space in which it's hard for just one piece to fall. So I don't know. I think you're absolutely right, though, about Orban's strategy, which is, and what I can imagine him doing is that if he becomes the problem, he'll put some loyalist in, stand back, everybody says, aha, the problem is solved, and then you swap him back in again after the danger is over. So that's another Putin strategy. If I'd shown you my Putin slides, I would have done the Medvedev swap, So that kind of thing I can imagine. But, the problem in Hungary is that the destruction of the political opposition is so complete. And this is something Brussels worries about all the time. Who else would govern? Literally there are no parties that have the a deep enough bench to step in to govern in place of Fidesz. So, I think there's just so much that really, the end game of this is really not clear in Hungary and how exactly this would work. But the danger with using, a collapsed economy as the way to get rid of, this is how they got rid of Berlusconi in Italy, right? Which was essentially, the government was almost declared bankrupt. There was a caretaker government swapped in. I can't imagine Orban doing that. So I'm not sure how this ends. I think it's not going to be good for anybody how this ends. So I'm not cheering about the end, but I'm also not cheering about the way things are. So, yeah, he's really locked everything down at this stage.
There, yes.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Elena. I'm a visiting fellow here at IWM and at Reset. Thank you for this excellent talk. I remember back in 2017, I listened to a TED talk right after Trump by a Czech NGO who I think was called Democracy 2.0, or the idea was called Democracy 2.0. Yeah. And the idea is that voters should have 2 votes instead of 1, so 1 in favor and 1 against. And the idea is that this would prevent very unpopular candidates such as Trump from being elected if so many people are against them. So what do you think about it? And obviously it's been many years and it hasn't been implemented anywhere in the world as far as I know. And do you think it's because, why do you think that is? Is it because this would undermine the power of those in power, or is it just too technically difficult to change electoral systems? Or are there any problems with this idea from the point of view of theory of democracy, more conceptual issues? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. So there's a lot of really creative proposals about how to have better elections. The problem is how you enact them as law with legislatures who have been elected under different rules, right? So this is the dilemma, is that when you have a sitting parliament, they were the ones who benefited from the rules that are already there, so they often don't really want to change them. And also, a lot of systems that look pretty good, like the Hungarian system, looked very good because it was very hard to rig, actually, at the beginning. It turns out that most election systems have some kind of fatal weakness that in the specific place where the electoral system is working can be manipulated to rig elections. This whole idea of how election law gets twisted in different places to give advantages to different political parties could be, it is an academic specialty by itself, but there's no shortage of good ideas. The question is exactly how to ever enact them. And that's why I'm saying that if we can get new governments in some of these places, and there's a little bit of and then a miracle happened, here's this disastrous, and then we're going to have a new government. So what happens in the middle, I'm not entirely sure, but if you get a new government, then this is one of the things that civil sector groups can promote, right, is some kind of relatively tamper-proof election system that would prevent, all of these election systems that I tried to talk about today were all deeply flawed before these autocrats came to power, and they remain flawed. They're still open to these forms of abuse, so yes, we can do better. The question is who's going to enact those laws and whether they already have too much at stake in the flawed system that got them there. So yeah, election law reform is the hardest. And it's where every country is at its worst, I might say.
Remember to introduce yourself.
Yes, all right. I guess everyone else is standing up, so I will too. Yeah. My name is Jeff Manners. I am not an academic. I'm a retired insurance executive who's worked over 40 years in Central and Eastern Europe.
Good for you. Good.
Thank you. My question, is there a glimmer of hope let's say, within the Republican Party, that they may abandon Trump, or two, they may go the way of the Whig Party, as it did in the 19th century. We've seen some potential for this, let's say, with the Lincoln Project in the last election. Two, we have the loony fringe, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Could that be enough to provoke some reaction within, let's say, what we could call the mainstream Republicans, where they may put up their own candidate, then Trump will run anyways, and we could get a 1912 election scenario? What are your views on these possibilities?
Yeah, so here's the problem, is that the Republican Party, excuse me, is really now Trump's party, right? There just aren't dissident factions within it. There isn't a grown-up conservative movement dedicated to preserving the Constitution and fair elections, you know? So it's really hard to know how to work with that. So one problem is that when you have these first-past-the-post elections, it's very hard to have third parties, right? This has always been the UK's issue. 2.5 parties is sort of what you can manage, or regional parties maybe. But it's very hard to develop a third party. So there's this effort in the US to develop something called the No Labels Party, which sounds great, right? Like, so we're sick of Democrats, we're sick of Republicans, we're going to have a party with no labels, they're going to run all these vanilla candidates who could appeal to everybody. What could be wrong with that? And the answer is they will probably bring Trump to power because the Trump supporters are not going anywhere. And they are numerous enough that if you split the vote between, you know, you split the sanity vote between, you know, a no labels party and the Democrats, Trump will win. So it's very hard to figure out a way out of this, really. And so what a lot of American analysts are saying, the only thing that's going to get the Republican Party to reform are more election defeats. And they've actually had 3 big election defeats. I mean, the midterm elections in 2018 were just a wipeout for the Republican Party. Losing the presidential election by 7 million votes is a pretty severe loss. Losing these last midterms, right? This was supposed to be the elections between presidential elections where you have just Congress running, or called midterm elections. So the ones we just had in 2022 were supposed to be a Republican victory. Like every other midterm election goes against the party in the White House. And basically the fact that the Senate, the Democrats increased their margin in the Senate and only barely lost the House is just a miracle in the historical comparison. So we've had 3 elections in which the Republican Party has been defeated pretty soundly nationally. And they're not changing yet. So it's going to take a 4th loss and a 5th loss and so on. But again, given the quirkiness of the American electoral system, you're not guaranteed that the person with the most votes wins. The distribution of those votes matters. And also now what we're seeing is that after the last presidential election, which of course Trump denied that he lost, there's been this mass harassment of election workers who have been leaving offices in droves, and the Republicans are now sending their, you know, party soldiers kind of into these neutral jobs to count the votes. That's my biggest fear here, because the U.S. has had a pretty rickety election machinery, but if you start filling it up with partisans who are going to throw out every other ballot, you know, so we're not out of the woods yet. I mean, I'm really terrified about the United States. I think all of the complacency that we've had this democracy for so long, it's a 200-year-old system that was never updated. So it's like try driving a car that old down a road, right? I mean, basically, there are political technologies that require updating of systems, and the U.S. has never done it. Britain has had a bit the same problem because its history has been considered its biggest asset, you know, and I think the U.S. is in real danger. And until we get a republic, I mean, the most important thing the U.S. could get right now is a sane conservative party. But I don't see one.
Well, Kim, that I think the central message of your talk here is pretty unambiguous. We all have to start panicking about the US. But there was much more in it. Now I'm having, because we have a strict timetabling system here, I'm having to bring the discussion to the end. But the good news is everyone is invited to go downstairs to the canteen and, with a little lubricating Brindlemeyer, carry on the discussion
Great.
with equal intensity. But before we disport ourselves there, let us please give a big round of applause to King.
Thank you.